Welcome to the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. I'm Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. This podcast is a ministry of the Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, where I pastor here in Palo Alto, California. On today's episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, I have the privilege of talking to Dr. Jessica Joustra. Is it Joustra or
We've been fully Americanized. It's Joustra.
oh, it's Joustra. Okay, Joustra. Dr. Jessica Joustra. I'm glad I clarified that. And she is the assistant professor of religion and theology at Redeemer University in Ancaster, Ontario. She is also the program director for religion and theology, as well as the director of Redeemer's Albert M. Wolters Center for Christian Scholarship. She earned a PhD in Christian ethics from Fuller Theological Seminary and the Free University in Amsterdam, and an MDiv from Calvin Theological Seminary. She is an editor and translator of Herman Bavinck's Reformed Ethics, Volume 1, Created, Fallen, and Converted Humanity, and Reformed Ethics, Volume 2, The Duties of the Christian Life. She's also the co-editor with her husband, Robert Joustra, of Calvinism for a Secular Age, a 21st century reading of Abraham Kuyper's Stone Lectures. And that's the book we're going to focus in on today. So, Jessica, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you and just to get to see you, just even if it's over Zoom, to see kind of where you're working from. As we begin our conversation, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about your own journey, how you came to study theology. What were the key people, places, and things that shaped you to get you to where you are today?
Yeah, wonderful. My students ask this question of me very often. And so I teach, of course, theology students, and they often ask me, so you studied theology as well? It's not really a question, but there's a question in there
Hmm.
somewhere. And I always surprise them and say, no, I really didn't. I come by theology a bit circuitously. I ended up, it was at Calvin College where things really kind of shifted for me, and I turned directly towards theology as an academic discipline and kind of started focusing in on what would become my vocation. And before that, I was always interested in these theological questions. I mean, I remember acutely, and this should have told me more than it did at the time, but at my high school religion class, I remember they had us read the canons of Dort and write
Oh,
maybe unexpected, but we did do that. It was a Christian school. We were mostly Christian Reformed kids, so we were really reading the canons of Dort along with many other things.
mhm.
But we were supposed to write a paragraph kind of summarizing our reaction to the canons of Dort. And I remember writing, I think, 6 pages. And I had a lot of questions and queries, as many young people do when they read that particular document. And that maybe should have told me that this was something I was interested in beyond kind of my peers. No one else turned in 6 pages. But that didn't clue me in at all. I just thought I might have some questions about the canons of Dort, which later became nicely resolved thanks to a wonderful professor at Calvin, now University, Laura Smith. She really straightened me out on those things. But it was another professor. His name is Dave Warners in the biology program, which is where I was as a Calvin
Hmm.
student. And he taught me plants, plant biology, plant taxonomy, all of these things, and really helped me connect the dots in a way that was in the water. I mean, if I had taken a serious look at, say, how my parents lived out their faith, my father is a psychologist and his faith deeply informs his work. My mother, an educator, her faith deeply informs her work. It was right there in front of me, but you can't always see it when it's right there in front of me. And he really helped me connect the dots of this God who cares about not only my personal life, my spiritual life, my prayer life, my devotional life, but the whole world. In many ways, I find a lot of kinship in the way Lewis Smedes talks about his time at Calvin College. He says, "I learned the joy of the Lord in English 101," and then talks about a God who delights in well-formed sentences. And I learned the joy of the Lord in, I don't remember the number, I think biology 142? That's probably wrong. But in plant biology, where I learned the joy of the Lord who cared not only about our souls, not only about this heaven that seemed far away, but about the whole created reality, and who had fashioned it with care and intricacy and cared how we upheld it, and had that, and that was an integral part of Christian discipleship. And again, that was right in front of me my whole life. I grew up in a family of Dutch immigrants. The Dutch Reformed tradition that we'll talk about was right there in my home, in my family lineage. And then I kind of had to leave that in some way to encounter it afresh, in folks who were similarly applying that good insight of Kuyper's "every square inch," his famous line. And I saw it at Calvin, and it was that then kind of helped me realize that the kinds of things I cared about, were really wide. Yes, I still cared about plant biology, but I also cared about the kind of theological presuppositions that helped professors like mine make bold claims about God and about discipleship and about stewardship that were all encompassing. That led me to Calvin Seminary, led me to John Bolt, who teaches there. He introduced me, not only by kind of concept, which I had heard again at the knee of my parents in the classroom at Calvin University. He introduced me then by name to Bavinck and Kuyper, and then I just kept going.
Oh, that's wonderful. It strikes me that you're saying you were in the Dutch Calvinist Christian Reformed environment your entire life, but something was different about getting out of your parents' home, away from your home church, and to a new place called college, and it happened to be Calvin College. Um, do you find as a professor today teaching college students that you see some of that same things that they're being reintroduced to topics and concepts they've heard many times before?
Absolutely. So Redeemer, where I teach, is in many ways very similar to Calvin. Both schools with deep roots in the Christian Reformed Church. Redeemer is, of course, not owned and operated by the Christian Reformed Church, but is affiliated with it among a number of other denominations. And so we have a lot of kids who have grown up in the same environment that I did, and a lot of them, and this was true of me too. They're being introduced or reintroduced to terms they've heard very often, terms like common grace, terms, all of these terms that are kind of in the water in Dutch Reformed circles, sphere sovereignty. You can just keep going with all of these, and it takes a kind of, not a kind of, it takes real humility to be able to say, I don't know that as well as I thought I did. Because for me, and I've seen this in my students as well, these terms that you think you know just kind of slide over you and you don't actually see how profound they are. Or you just take it for granted that this is something that is part of the Christian faith writ large. And so, what's so special about something like common grace? And it's only when you, I think, step outside of some of those bubbles, and I don't mean bubbles in a pejorative sense. I think, forming children and forming a faith community in kind of a robust faith community that's connected with school, home, church, all of those things. I think that can be a wonderful blessing. And so again, bubbles are not pejorative in that sense, but to step out of that a little bit and see, oh wow, other people think differently. Other Christians think differently, and then people who are not Christians think really differently. And I actually have tools that I didn't know I had that give me something profound to say. And it's easy to take for granted when that's all around you. It's
Mm,
harder to take for granted when you confront something very different, whether that be kind of in a book, reading someone that's saying something very different, or just kind of as you're going around your day-to-day life, encountering different ideas, either from different Christian traditions that are ever so slightly different, or with a kind of different accent is the way I talk with my students about that, or people that have radically different ways of viewing the world. And so, I mean, it does take some of that, I think, realization that this isn't as standard maybe as you think it would be, and some humility to say, I thought I knew that, and I really don't understand it as well as I think that I did. And I had, even just this past semester, I taught a class called Gospel, Church, and Culture, which is one of my favorite classes to teach, and also, I mean, one of the most difficult classes to teach as we think about kind of applying these big questions in theology, theological studies, biblical studies to the pressing questions of our time. Uh, and I had a student who said almost exactly that. I didn't know what I had. I didn't know the kind of tools that I had in my toolbox. I didn't know how rich they were, and I didn't know how kind of uniquely accented they were. And for me, at least in my story, I mean, this really was made profound. I mean, I started to learn it at Calvin University. It was really, I mentioned Dave Warner's. He was fundamental. It was also a little book from Richard Mouw called "When the Kings Come Marching In."
Mhm.
Still one of the books that I say changed my life. And by change my life, I mean told me what everyone around me already thought, and I didn't know how special it was. And he said it in just such a beautiful way. And then when I went to Fuller, I met a lot of other students that were studying Dutch Reformed theology, but none of them had grown up in it. And all of them had these stories of how this kind of brought the pieces together. It gave them language for some of the things they intuitively felt. I think of a friend of mine who was working in business and then became pastor and now professor, and thought through, I actually now have language to talk about why not only what I'm doing now, but what I was doing then is a Christian kind of thing. And he didn't have that language before. And so it was a lot of, for me and for some of my students, figuring out there's this gift that I have that I didn't know I had. And it's hard for someone, I mean, you can't just say, look at how great this gift is, right? It would be easy if we could just tell them. Um, but I'm reminded by one of my professors at Calvin Seminary who always said, "Show not tell, show not tell, show not tell," and it took a lot of showing me as I encountered people that again just didn't didn't kind of embody this in a very natural way, like the people that I grew up with, um, saying, "Wow, there's something really special here," and I think I do see a lot of that in my students too.
It reminds me of like my work in the church uh, as a pastor, working with congregants who have been raised in the church. Now, like you, raised in the Christian Reformed Church in particular. Um, and it it's like I have to be reminded as a pastor that okay, I'm saying the same things over and over and over again to these people. And sometimes we need to take a step back and be like, what is it that we're saying and what is special about what we're saying? Like, we've been saying the same thing over and over again, but what is it? Why do we keep going back to the sovereignty of God? Why do we
Mm,
keep going back to God's unconditional love? Why do we keep going back to the gospel of Jesus? And it's like, yeah, any message, no matter how amazing it is, can sometimes become, it just becomes the water you swim in, and then you don't think
mhm,
about it anymore. Yeah,
mhm.
so I love that. I'm glad that uh, all of your students get an opportunity to re-encounter some of the things they were taught, and I'm sure a lot of students who didn't grow up in the Christian Reformed Church who get to hear it. Um, so let's talk a little bit about your book on Calvinism for a Secular Age. Oh, what is the context for Calvinism for a Secular Age? Why did this book need to be written?
Yeah, wonderful. So the title makes it seem perhaps a bit broader than what the book is actually doing. So it is Calvinism for a Secular Age. The subtitle gets really specific, but we were told that can't be the actual title because who's going to buy it? And our editors were absolutely right. But the subtitle is, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. You have the book in front of you. A 21st century reading of Kuyper's Stone Lectures.
Yeah.
And so my husband and I edited this volume with a number of our friends who are just wonderful experts in this tradition. And we had all kind of had these moments, but I mean, a lot of them came through my husband and I kind of talking as we went around and we taught Kuiper's lectures. So I think of, there's faith and work programs at Redeemer Presbyterian, and we went and talked to people there who were really excited about Kuiper's Stone lectures, but also, kind of quietly afterwards would say, "This is kind of hard to read. What's actually going on here?" Or we had that with, faculty workshops or with students that would say, there are a number of, and they wouldn't say it exactly like this, but what they were communicating is there are a number of barriers to this work. And their barriers are at least twofold. One of them is that it's really, I mean, at this point, we're 100 years away, and it even more than 100 years. And the distance in language and concepts, the kind of intellectual water that Kuyper and his audience were swimming in, are not the exact intellectual currents we're swimming in. So there's a lot of references, names, ideas, concepts that are really difficult to simply wade in and see those gems of genius that you get in these lectures. The other one is much more difficult in that there are real conceptual difficulties and conceptual errors, grave errors that Kuyper makes in these lectures, and we can talk about them perhaps a bit more later. But you see blatant examples of disturbing claims about race in these lectures, and those are rightly so a barrier to saying what's going on here? Why should I read this? How should I read this? How should I grapple correctly? And so it's one thing. I mean, I again, as someone that grew up in the Dutch Reformed tradition, you tell me that this is a guy in my tradition. These are some important lectures that he gave in North America. You should read them. I'll say okay, and I'll kind of get them. You tell someone that's not from this tradition, you should read this guy, and there's some really great worldview insights. Also, there's all this other stuff. That's a bit of a harder sell. But we think, I'll speak for both of us, that there's really something important in these lectures, and that persists and that endures. And it's their insights worth getting out. Their insights worth grappling with, worth taking for Christian life in the world today. But we also want to take seriously that there are these real barriers. Some of them kind of merely, let's help explain what's going on, but some of them are real conceptual difficulties that we need to make sense of how to think about. And there are different schools of thought for how you would think about someone like Kuyper, where you encounter real difficulty, real trouble, real error in the text. What do you do? Do you just throw it away? Do you just say man of their time? Is there something else we can do? We want to think with our authors, especially Vince Bacot, that there's another way that doesn't just do throw it out or say just a man of its time. We don't have to really grapple with it. It's okay. We all would have made those mistakes. We want to say there's another way, and we also want to say there's still insights here worth reading, and not only worth reading, there's still insights here that get at something deeply true about who God is, how God works, and how that plays out in every area of our life.
So, what led Abraham Kuyper to give these talks? He gave these talks in North America, gave some in Princeton, some in Holland, Michigan.
Yeah.
So, what was the impetus for that?
Wonderful. So these are Kuyper Stone lectures. So sometimes they're entitled Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism, which was the name of the lectures he gave. Sometimes the Stone lectures, which are the lecture series. So you'll find other people's Stone lectures as well. For example, I'll give a shout out to his colleague Bavinck. Later on, Bavinck gives Stone lectures, The Philosophy of Revelation, also well worth reading. But the Stone lectures are this lecture series at Princeton, which is, I mean, in its heyday of kind of old Princeton Reformed theology. I mean, there's Warfield is here. There's a lot going on. This is kind of a center of gravity for North American Reformed thought. And Kuyper is invited, which shows again. I mean, Kuyper's global influence. He was a Dutchman who was invited to come internationally deliver these lectures. And so he did. He delivered the full set of lectures, and you can read about each one of the lectures in the book or in the original lectures if you'd like. And then he re-delivered his lecture, The Future of Calvinism, in Holland, Michigan. So first he goes to Princeton, where he gives the full lectures, and then he, on his tour of North America, visits some Dutch diaspora communities, the center of which is Holland, Michigan, where he gives this lecture once again.
So, what was well, when I was reading this, and you write this really lovely conclusion to the book, and you say there was kind of three different focuses, three principles, which was the sphere sovereignty,
Mm,
the world and life view, and then the Catholicity of the
mm,
faith. So I wonder if we could just break those down a little bit. In his lectures, what is he getting at when he's talking about the sovereignty of God and especially
yeah.
sphere sovereignty?
Yeah, wonderful. So Kuyper has in his lectures one of my favorite lines. Most people, when they think of Kuyper's favorite lines, they think of the every square inch line, which is lovely. Doesn't actually come from these lectures, fun fact, but it is lovely. There's no square inch over which Christ does not call mine. That's beautiful. But in the lectures, he also says, and this is my favorite line, the dominating principle of Calvinism is not soteriology, that is justification by faith, but it's cosmologically the sovereignty of the triune God over all of creation. And there, what he's saying is, we often think of, and we have this today too, when you think of Calvin or Calvinism, you think of tulip or the canons of Dort, which is where we began. And you can see why people would think that. There's lots of people. What is Calvinism? Tulip. What is Calvinism? Predestination. And I'm not here to say it's not that. Calvinism obviously has a robust word, and I think a very wonderful and good. And of course, Calvin understood this as a comforting word. I think we ought to as well. A very fulsome word about our salvation. But that's not where Calvinism begins, Kuyper argues. Calvinism begins with a God who is sovereign, full stop, not simply over our salvation, though he, of course, is sovereign over our salvation, but a God who is sovereign over all of it, over all of creation. And that, of course, takes the focus off of simply us. Then Calvinism doesn't begin with me and my salvation. Calvinism begins with a God who is transcendent and immanent, a God who is sovereign, and a God who is over all. And so that, of course, for Kuyper, means wonderful things about our salvation, but it means first and foremost, we begin that Calvinism is a confession of God's ultimate sovereignty over everything. And so that means for him that sovereignty in Calvinism has wide scale implications. Yes, about our salvation, absolutely, but also about every sphere, every kingdom, everything visible and invisible. God has a word for that. So God has ordered, God has normed, and God upholds all of it. And so there's nothing then that we can say, and this is the whole basis of these lectures. There's nothing that's off limits for a Christian confession. There's nothing that God does not have a word over. God is not simply God over religion. God is not simply God over our hearts and our church. God is God over all of it. God has a good word for politics, for business, for family life, for everything that exists. God has a word and God is sovereign. And so for Kuyper, that means then, again, all of our lives, not just our spiritual life, not just what happens personally, but all of our life as individuals, our life corporately is lived coram Deo, one of his
Mm.
favorite lines, before the face of God, which means in all things we must submit to God's will. And God has a concrete, known and normed will for any area of life. And that's where he gets into sphere sovereignty, which is one of the things that Kuyper often talks about. When you think of Kuyper, you often think of sphere sovereignty for good reason. And what he means by that, again, is God is sovereign over all. And the sovereign God who is sovereign over all has normed and patterned all of life. And he's done that from creation. He built in, and Kuyper has this wonderful, fascinating exegetical claim in one of his lectures. It's called Uniformity, the Curse of the Modern Life. And in that lecture, he talks about Genesis, which is, why not start there? If we're talking about the beginning, we should start at the beginning. And he talks about Genesis 1:11, which says the plants multiplied according to their kind. And I'm not going to get it exactly right. I don't have it in front of me, but I'll give you a kind of um, uh, just basically what he says there. He says that word is not just for plants, it's for all of life. God built in this potential for all of creation to be multiplied according to its kind. And so he says then, yes, plants are to multiply according to their kind, to go into this wonderful diversity. It's not just the plants that God has created aren't just roses. There's roses and daisies and daffodils and tulips and many, many, many more. So there's this beautiful multiformity in the diversity of plants according to their kind. But he wants to say also there's this wonderful uniformity in the institutions of human society, in the callings of humanity, in everything. God has built in this good diversity, a diversity that again is in accord with God's will and way. So God not only has a pattern for plants, he has a pattern for politics, for family, for business, for education, for the church. And all of those things, plants accepted, he doesn't name plants as a sphere, though I should actually note, he doesn't actually delineate the spheres, which is one of the frustrations with Kuyper that some go to remedy in Doivard. So if you want, for lack of Kuyper's precision in some of this, you can go to Doivard and get all of the modal aspects very carefully delineated. But Kuyper says there are spheres. He's not going to give us exactly what they are, but he's going to say there are different areas of human activity. And all of them, again, are under God's authority, but all of them are normed slightly differently, not in a way that contradicts one another, but in a way that kind of shows us, again, the multiplicity of God's world. God has created the business to be a business, the family to be a family, the church to be a church. And one of my mentors, I've already mentioned him today, Richard Mao, has these wonderful examples of kind of getting very concretely about why that is. He talks about a mother and a son. And a mother and a son have a particular kind of relationship as mother and son in the family. But say the mother is a business owner and the son is an employee. And say the son does some really nefarious things and steals money from the company, does whatever the son's going to do. The mother can fire that son or divest the son's interest in the company without, of course, firing him as son. And so there's these different kinds of relationships, different norms for those relationships, different categories for those relationships. And some of that we just intuitively understand. You don't have to be Kuyperian to say, yeah, you should be fired over here, but not over there. But Kuyper says actually this is part of God's creational design. There are these different spheres, and God has given humanity limited authority. Then God has absolute authority. Humanity has limited authority in each of those spheres. And our authority is limited, A, because it's not ultimate, and B, because it's only derived from God, who then gives us the norms to follow. So we don't then, unlike, and here's where Kuyper's mentor, Groen van Prinster, would have a strong word. Unlike the French Revolution and its ideas, or modernity and its ideas, we don't make up those norms. We don't discover them or come to them together in terms of kind of collective decision making. We uncover them by means of God and his revealed way and will. So these aren't things that are malleable, these aren't things that are by human whim. God, in his original creation, set out all of these diverse spheres for his good purposes so that we might fill the earth.
Hmm.
Um, and so Kuyper's idea then is, yeah, we have all of these spheres, we have limited authority, and all of them sit below God, not just the church, but every sphere of life.
So, a couple of follow up questions. The first is, would you frame that idea that God is sovereign over all things as, is there another way to put that? Like, there isn't life and then the spiritual life, there's just life. And all of life is spiritual because God is invested and sovereign over all of it. Is that an accurate way to talk about that?
Yeah, that's wonderful. It reminds me of one of the people in Kuyper's line, a guy named Evan Runner, has this famous line: all of life is religion. There's
Mm,
nothing that's not religious. And that doesn't, of course, mean all of life is Christian. But what it does mean is we are all quorum Deu before the face of God. And then we have a choice. We either submit or we reject. But the choice is not be underneath or before the face of God or not. The choice is this is where we are. Now, how do we respond? Do we respond in faithfulness or unfaithfulness? And that's, of course, then a question for all of life, not just again for what we do in the church, though it says a lot about what we do in the church. Of course, it says everything about what we do in the church, but it's also for the rest of life. So, I mean, what that fundamentally means is nothing is neutral. There's not a kind of we can just come together neutrally in business or in politics or in anything and say there's no religiosity here. We actually have to say then we bring our full selves as people before the face of God, a God who is over all, into everything, as does everyone else.
mm. And in the church, because I think, your average Christian thinks of the church as the spiritual place, as the place
Mhm.
we go to think about God and to glorify God, to worship God, to hear from God. And then there's often this kind of segue into the week, which feels pretty disconnected from what's happening in church. But in Kuyper's view, would he see church, like the actual worship service with the preached word and the sacraments, as being um, like the culmination of all that
Mm.
we have done in the week, or the foundation for what we're going to do in the week?
Yeah, it's a great question. And here's where Kuyper, at some point, by some folks within the neo Calvinist tradition, has a bit of criticism directed at him. So someone that launches actually a pretty strong criticism is Klaus Schilder, who is now coming into the English speaking world in wonderful ways, thanks to the work of, especially there's a scholar in the Netherlands named Marinus de Young, who's doing wonderful work on Schilder, and George Harink, Marinus de Young, and Rich Mao actually translated a Schilder reader. Schilder's most known in America, or in North America, for his trilogy on Christ, which is a
Mm,
wonderful, piercing work. But he has a lot to say about ecclesiology, and that's where he really pushes against some of Kuyper's emphases. And he says, actually, we need to really focus on the centrality of the institutional church.
mm,
And when Kuyper talks about church, he doesn't deny the importance of the institutional church, but he does talk about the church in two ways. And your question kind of got at this, right? He talks about the church as institute and organism. He has a sermon, again, it's been translated into English, it's well worth a read, called Rooted and Grounded, where he talks about these two aspects of the church. And Bavinck, actually his colleague, so we're talking about Abraham Kuyper here, who's much more well known, though Bavinck's coming up really, really strongly right behind him, and maybe
he
we'll
needed 100
match
years
him.
to kinda catch up.
He did. Uh, but Kuyper's colleague Bavinck, who is a systematic theologian, actually took Kuyper's chair at the Free University when Kuyper was not able to fulfill it for a number of other vocational reasons. Bavinck is a wonderful systematician, and he makes very clear the priority of the institutional church, and then how out of that flows the or the church as organism. And when they say these two distinctions, they mean the institutional church is exactly what you've identified, right? The gathered worship where there are offices of the church, the word and sacrament, the kind of thing that you think of when you most often think of church. When we say church, we usually think of that thing. There's the church down the corner or the denomination, but somehow the gathered kind of ministry of word and sacrament that's gathered around with offices and all of these kinds of things. That's what they would call the institutional church. But then they would say the church is more than simply that. It's not less than, but it's more. The church is also organism. The church is also the body of Christ sent out to go and live coram deo before the face of God in every area of life. And Bavinck makes very clear the priority that out of the institutional church, out of being fed and nourished by the word and at the table, flows our life in the world. Kuyper doesn't quite make that as clear. I think you can read it that way, but I mean, some of Kuyper's own biography attests to the way he holds up both of those in a really radical way and in an important way as kind of a corrective to simply saying church is over here. Church is just that thing we do on Sundays, but it actually flows out into every part of our life. He makes that really clear. The priority he makes a little less clear, but that's clarified in Bavinck.
Yeah, so, when Bob or not Bobbing, but Kuiper, when he's talking about, as you mentioned, the sphere sovereignty and the different roles that each sphere has, I'm just going back to that real quick before we move on. When I think about, you said that a business should be a business, a family should be a family, a political leader should be a political leader, that kind of thing. Do we run into the rub in our lives, like when we go to a coffee shop or we go to some business and then they're making it very clear to us that they support this political agenda or they are against these things in our culture, and all of a sudden it feels like, oh, I'm not just getting a cup of coffee, I'm like part of this political movement.
Mm, mhm,
And is that, like, I've thought about that in light of Kuiper's sphere sovereignty, and I've thought,
mm,
"Oh, I wonder if this is what he's getting at, that this business is doing more than what a business maybe in his mind ought to do." Is that
mm.
true?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do think I've mentioned Doivard here, and I'm surprising myself by how much I'm talking about Doivered. But Doivered is kind of second generation neo-Calvinist, and he really does flesh out some of the things that Kuyper talks about when he talks about sphere sovereignty. But I think Kuyper would want to say two things. The first is that we would kid ourselves, and I don't think this is what you're saying, but I'm going to say it anyways. We would kid ourselves by saying that a business could be neutral, right? That a business would just serve the coffee. Um, and coffee is a neutral thing. He would want to say, actually, everything has significance, has religiosity. There's no neutrality even in that cup of coffee, even in the way, I mean, in the way you price things and all of these. Nothing is neutral, and actually all of it is religious. So what he doesn't want to do is have a kind of quasi secular understanding of like here's where religion fits in and here's where it doesn't. What he does want to do is say here's where institutional church fits in and here's where the church as organism is. So none of this is saying, you must abandon your central convictions, or importantly, my neighbor must abandon central convictions in how they do their work. And those central convictions may deeply differ with ours, but none of us should abandon that. We ought necessarily say everything we do has a direction. And that's where the language of directionality, I think, is really important. And it comes from Al Walters, who talks about both structure and direction. And this gets back to Kuyper's sphere sovereignty, because he says all of life has this created structure, what it was meant to be. With the fall, what it was meant to be isn't always seen as acutely because it's misdirected. So something of that createdness remains. The way God intended it remains, but it's misdirected, or it can be appropriately directed. And we see that in, I mean, like the business example. Business in and of itself is, we can understand it as a good thing that God has created to be filled properly. But you can fill it properly or improperly. You can think of obvious examples with, price gouging or usury or something like that. But you can also think of subtle examples. What does it look like to not be directed towards the glory of God in our coffee shop? Or you can ask the other question, right? What does it look like to have a Christian coffee shop? And that's more nuanced than we like to think of it as, right? One of my favorite examples is here in Ontario. We have something called the Christian Farmers Federation. And they're trying to ask that very question. If it is true that there's nothing that's neutral, and if it is true that there are spheres that God has designed and given us limited authority, then what does it mean to steward that limited authority well in the sphere that I'm working in? And for them, that's farming. So, what does it mean to farm something God has structured into creation directionally towards God? What does it mean to have my chicken be the chickeniest chicken it can be to glorify God? What does it look like to actually offer all of that as a service to God, saying, you have given us these good gifts. You have patterned into creation ways that we ought do them, and we want to submit ourselves to that design. And so the Christian Farmers Federation is doing exactly that, asking the kinds of questions like, what does it mean to be a Christian farmer? And the answer is much more complicated than praying before I slaughter my chickens. Doesn't mean we don't pray before we slaughter our chickens, but it means there's more to that story. Because again, God is sovereign over every sphere. And with the praying, and again, I don't want to be against praying. I'm not against praying. But if we simply kind of put prayer on top of something, we've not yet gotten to Kuyper's insight here that, of course, we ought pray in every area of our life. We ought offer all of these things up to God very explicitly through prayer, but that's not it. That's the starting, not the ending. And so if we're going to pray before we farm, and that's a wonderful thing, then we must also, says Kuyper, think about the way that prayer, that orientation towards God, that desire to be in relationship with Him, to communicate with Him, to submit to Him, matters for what comes next.
Mhm. Yeah, it reminds me of what Eugene Peterson said. He said in one of his books at some point that all of life is prayer.
Mm,
And it's in the sense that you're meaning, like when you see that God is the ultimate reality and that he sets the tone of life, and that everything I do from the moment I step out of bed and put on my shoes to kiss my kid goodbye to school as she goes to school, or go to work, or um, talk about my finances with my spouse, all of these moments are under God and to be directed toward him. And when we can live like that as Christians, when we have the imagination to really see that all of life is under God, then all of life really does become prayer, that it's all
Mm,
directed toward him.
mhm,
So I think that's really, really good. Yeah, and it also strikes me that it's in our contemporary Christian culture in North America, we can think of when something is Christian as being like the Christian radio station,
mhm,
or or having a T-shirt that has a cross on it, or something like that, where it's like, oh, they're making Christian songs because they are songs specifically for praise and worship, for church. But what I'm hearing you saying is that, like, no, you could actually be a Christian musician that's not necessarily making liturgical songs or hymns for the church, but is writing music with this mindset that, like, this is for God's glory, this is under God, and I'm writing the best music I can write for His glory.
Yeah, absolutely. And none of that, of course, means that wearing a shirt with a cross or writing Christian songs is bad. It's
No,
actually
no.
deeply good, right?
Mhm.
But it does mean we run the risk of limiting our imagination of what God calls us to if we say that's all that's Christian.
Mm.
And again, none of that is to say that's not Christian, but it is to say, actually, both in that work, in the work of songwriting, in the work of making a shirt with a cross, we actually need to look, we need to we need to dig really deep and ask questions of direction in every part of that process, the same way we would ask questions of direction, sovereignty, norming, submission in the rest of life.
Yeah. So, in that spirit of deepening our imagination or growing our imagination, I want to reflect with you about a couple of metaphors that Kuyper used, which I thought
Mm,
were really helpful. One is the religious porch, from which you look out at the world. And then the other one is I think this is how you say it, the Aeolian harp.
yeah.
And I just wondered if you could speak to those a little bit, as to why he was using those kind of metaphors.
Yeah, wonderful. So one of them he explicitly uses in the lectures on Calvinism. The other one he doesn't. He uses those in devotions that he wrote. And the reason that I brought in both of these is because my fear in talking about Kuyper's stone lectures is that neo Calvinism gets the kind of reputation that it sometimes already has. That these people are really focused on the here, the now, what to do now, to go out into the world, to partner with God in what he's doing now. They're into transformation and they kind of forgot about piety and church and all of those things because they're out there doing things. And if we really look at Kuyper, I mean, you can get the impression that it's all about going out there doing things if you just read these lectures. These lectures are a very small part of course, what Kuyper wrote in his entire corpus. And Kuyper's entire corpus is filled with, I mean, he writes substantial multiple volumes of devotions. He writes systematic theology. He writes political speeches. He writes educational speeches. He writes these kind of things. He is all over the map. And we've often focused so much on that world engagement part that we've missed some of the questions of piety. And I mean, Al Wolter says this really nicely. I think I might even quote him somewhere in the book. Um, he says neo Calvinists are noted more for their intellectual ability, their cultural transforming zeal, than for their personal living, their personal godliness or their living relationship with Christ. And that should pierce us to the heart, right? And that does not mean, again, that cultural transforming zeal is bad. I think it's deeply good. It's part of what God calls us to. But it flows out of course, properly situated, a living relationship with Jesus Christ. And lectures all about culture transforming, which are what these lectures are. What is the word of God in religion, in politics, in scholarship, in all of these things, can lead us to a kind of uncritical thinking on Kuyper that says he's only about cultural engagement, or neo Calvinism is only about cultural engagement. I've heard that from time to time, and part of it is warranted. Neo Calvinists talk a lot about cultural engagement, but properly speaking, and you see a lot of neo Calvinists doing this just beautifully, both in kind of the neo Calvinist moment in the Netherlands when it all started, and now, is that worldviewing, cultural engagement, and piety are hand in hand. And you see that if you get a kind of fulsome sense of who Kuyper was.
Mm.
And we get glimpses of it in the lectures. That's what this Aeolian harp is about. He ends his lectures talking about the Aeolian harp that needs the quickening spirit of God. That these lectures, these ideas, this desire to go out and have an answer for the challenges of the day. And Kuyper wants to be very clear. We have an answer for the challenges of the day that's rooted in God's sovereignty. But he wants to say it's not about us. Again, it all comes back to being about God. And so we may be an instrument that God uses in his world, but we are the instrument and God is the one who's playing, right? God is the one, the quickening spirit of God is the thing that makes that music. And you don't get the music in the harp without someone plucking the strings. In the same way, willing and ready agents that God may and does use are only able to work when we are when we are filled and when it's God who is working through us. And so already there we get a very strong sense that kind of counters some of those tendencies that you see in some receptions of neo-Calvinism to say, look what you can do, look what you should do, look what you can do in the culture, transform, transform, transform. And what Kuyper gives us there is absolutely God is in the business of transformation. And God, by his good graces and good design, deems us worthy or unworthy, but still usable in this grand project. That's the way, for some reason, God and his sovereignty designed it. But it's God, God's sovereignty, and God's design that then uses us. And we see that in Kuyper with this Aeolian harp. We are absolutely an agent and an instrument that God uses, but it's God who is overall in all through all, and to use the kind of both crass and beautiful analogy, plucking the strings of that harp. And you see this even more so, and this is that porch thing that I talked about. You see this even more so in some of his devotions that flesh out again this deeply pious sense of Kuyper's that, and for him, these two go hand in hand. Absolutely, we are called out, but we are called out by God. We are acted upon and through God. This is God's work. And again, this all comes back to him, for him, God's sovereignty. It is God who is sovereign over all, including our lives, including our actions, including God's good design for this world. And so it is God who uses us. Um, and so he wants to say, God is sovereign over every square inch, and therefore we go. But he also wants to say, equally as strong, we must, as we go and while we go, be near unto God in piety, prayer, and worship. The two are not divorced, they actually are centrally connected. And all of it comes back to God's sovereignty.
It makes me think of the Aeolian harp metaphor. Makes me think of like a wind chime on my tree in my yard.
Mm,
Is that without the wind, nothing's going to happen. It doesn't make the beautiful sound it makes, and without God's spirit blowing into our lives, we're just trying to make life better, but we don't actually have the power of God with us. And it's really that spirit of God working in and through us that is so important. And yeah, you're right. It starts with this inner transformation of ourselves. And I think maybe one of the struggles that Christians have is that prevents them from going out into the world at times to engage the world in Kuyper's kind of mindset is that, oh, I don't feel transformed enough, right? I
mm,
don't feel good enough
mm,
to be able to go out. And, but I think what Kuyper helps me with is like, you're being transformed. You're not going to ever be transformed enough before you get out there. Like you've got to go out there and be part of the world and engage the world. um, all the while this transformation is taking place. And I love that he has both of these in tension because um, it's like the conservative liberal tension, or you choose any two kind of binaries, and it's always like we want to pick one or the other. But he's showing us time and again, like no, these are united. They're organically connected, and
Right.
I so love that. So I think we're about time on our show today, so I'm gonna leave it there. But Jessica, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I can just tell that this lights you up, and that just excites me. We just need the best kind of teachers. I always think are the teachers that love what they're teaching, and I can tell that that is totally you. So thank you for teaching us today and just being a voice, continued voice at Redeemer amongst your students and in the church at large. We really appreciate you. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with Jessica Joustra. We talked about a lot of different things in regards to Calvinism in the secular age. We covered Abraham Kuyper. We talked about Herman Bavinck. We talked about sphere sovereignty, and we talked about world and life view. These are all topics that are covered in Jessica's book, Calvinism for a Secular Age. So I encourage you to go and support her by picking up a copy for yourself. Join us next time for a conversation with Calvin Seminary professor Corey Wilson on worship and work. How does our work show up in worship? How can these two parts of our lives be integrated into a whole that honors and glorifies God?